You've mentioned causality a couple times, so let's kind of maybe flesh this out a little for people who've never heard the argument. As I understand Hume, this variant of his skepticism is to say, look, I know it's common to talk as if when the billiard ball hits the other billiard ball, it causes that billiard ball to move. But the fact is, all we know for sure is that every time we've seen a billiard ball hit another billiard ball in that manner, we have then seen the billiard ball move. That doesn't establish a relationship like what we really mean by causality. I mean, it could be that the world is just a movie. When you see a movie, you might see a billiard ball in a movie hit another billiard ball and the thing moves, but if you think about the way movies are made, there's no causality there. It's just a sequence of images that were already printed on the film, right? So, and I think there, maybe it does matter what you believe, because if you doubt causality enough, then one direction to go in is, well, then it's all just a movie. It's predetermined. I have no effect on it. You could go in that direction, and that would matter. I mean, I think he's right that we by nature believe in the efficacy of causal intervention, right? I mean, it's very much related to the belief in free will.
Yeah, well, Hume certainly, I want to say that Hume believes in causality, but what his account of what causality consists of is not what you would normally think. And so, I mean, everything that Hume is skeptical about, he's skeptical about because of a basic framework that he operates in. And so, this framework is that everything that we can know falls into one of two categories. Either what he calls matters of fact or relations of ideas, right? And so matters of fact are normal empirical things,
that tree is out there.
The squirrel is brown,
right?
Or squirrels are warm-blooded. These are all matters of fact, and they're things that we know on the basis of experience, on the basis of observation. Mm-hmm. Relations of ideas are things that we know not on the basis of any experience, but on the basis of simply examining the meanings of words.
So this is logic? This is the realm of logic?
Logic and for Hume, mathematics. Okay, now Kant is going to problematize that later. So, for example, I know that squares are rectangles, right? But that's not a matter of fact. That's a relation of ideas, because a square is a kind of rectangle, right? Mm-hmm. Right. So as Kant would say later, in an analytic statement, the meaning of the predicate is already contained within the meaning of the subject.
Right. So Kant is the one who makes the distinction between analytic and synthetic, and those kind of roughly correspond to Hume's distinction, but not entirely.
It does correspond to it. It corresponds to it well enough for the purposes of our conversation.
So analytic is like the relationship among ideas, and synthetic is like statements about the reality we perceive.
That's right. And one of the things to notice is that that relations of ideas, the type of knowledge that this consists of is non-substantial, right? These are essentially tautologies, right, or logical truths. They don't represent any new knowledge when you know something like this. And this is important simply because in order to understand the analysis. So taking that framework, let's look at causality. Hume says, and the billiard ball example is fine. So we want to say that the cue ball hitting the 8 ball made the 8 ball move, right? Where what we mean by made it move is that there's some, what Hume calls necessary connection between the hitting and the moving, right? Mm-hmm. And Hume then says, well, let's look at it. Let's see where this idea of necessary connection comes from. And he says, well, when I look at it, all that I strictly speaking observe is one event followed by another. Mm-hmm. The first event is the pool ball hitting the 8 ball, and the second event is the 8 ball moving. He says, nowhere do I actually observe the necessary connection. I simply observe the sequence of events. He says, so it's not a matter of fact, the knowledge of belief in necessary connection. He says, but it's also not a relation of ideas. It doesn't logically follow from a ball from the it doesn't the statement the 8-ball moved does not logically follow from the statement the cue ball hit it, right? And so it's not a relation of ideas either. And so Hume then concludes that the belief in causality, if what you mean is necessary connection, is not verifiable. It cannot be justified by any rational means. So then but he doesn't stop there. If he'd stopped there, then he would just be a garden variety skeptic. But what does he do? He then goes on to explain where the perception of necessity comes from. And he says that the perception of necessity comes from a habit that's developed in the mind as a result of seeing this constant conjunction over and over again, to where next time when we see the cue ball hit the 8-ball, we're already expecting the 8-ball to move afterwards. We mistake that expectation for a necessary relation between the events, and we project it into the events. Mm-hmm. So Hume thinks there is causality, but what causality is constant conjunction plus psychological expectation, right? If what you mean is necessary connection, there ain't no much such thing in the world. There's just events following other events.
Now, but to be clear, there could be such a thing in the world, right? But it's just beyond the powers of our minds to state it with 100% confidence, because we have never seen all the possible cases, right? Who knows? Tomorrow the billiard ball will hit the other billiard ball and it won't move.
Okay, well now there you're getting into a different question, and that's the question of induction, right?
Right.
And that he also has a story about. He also believes that so an induction is a belief in some future event based on events in the past, mm-hmm. right? And so, yes, part of what happens is when I see the correlation, when I see the constant conjunction over and over again, I develop an expectation that then leads me to inductively infer that it's going to happen again next time. But Hume wants to say the same thing about inductive inference. He wants to say, there's no evidence for this either. We simply see a lot of things happen over and over and over again, and thus we build in ourselves up a kind of psychological expectation or habit. Yeah. Right? He says the only way that you can actually get a justification of induction is if you assume that the future will always be like the past. Right? But of course, that just is what we're trying to justify, right? The belief that the future will be like the past. In other words, you couldn't justify that inductively because we're trying to justify induction.
But you can show empirically that in the past, the future has tended to be like the past in certain respects.
You can show that, right, but what you can never show is that it will continue on that way forever.
No, you can't. But what's interesting, okay, so you're saying that's really a separate matter from the skepticism about causality that you were describing earlier. Right. The initial skepticism, even if you had observed all the cases of conjunction between two events that there have been and will ever be somehow magically. You've seen them all. It's always held that there's this conjunction. You're still not justified in saying one caused the other in the conventional sense of the term causality.
Right, because you never actually observe
the causality itself. It's like, what do we mean?
The making. You only observe the first event and the second event. You never observe the connection between them.
You know what this reminds me of a little is just the observation that, like, we talk about scientific laws, but we never talk about the mechanism for enforcing them. You know, it's like usually when we use the word law, we know why there is compliance with the law. When we talk about law with individual people, we know that, like, look, if people don't obey the law, they go to jail. That's why most people obey the law. There's a mechanism enforcing compliance. When you use the word law in the scientific sense, it's, I mean, I think Hume would be sympathetic to what I'm saying, right? Is like, we forget to ask, well, what makes this happen? I mean, if we knew what makes the regularity happen, then would he say, then we know what causality is?
There's no reason why Hume should object to statistical predictions, right? So in other words, if on the basis of this observed constant conjunction, right, I say the next time somebody hits a cue ball against an 8-ball, there's a high probability that the 8-ball is going to move. Hume has no objection to that kind of reasoning. right? And that is supported by the evidence. But what Hume wants to say is that our ordinary notion of causality, where what we mean isn't just one thing happening after another, but rather something making something happen.
Right.
That's what he thinks we don't have any rational justification for believing.
Right, and my point is kind of, in fact, when you think about it, it's hard to imagine what such knowledge would be like. What would a thing be like that makes it happen? What would a thing be like that enforces the laws of science?
Right.
And it's like, yeah. So really, yeah, all we know is this one thing keeps following the other thing.
Right.
Every
That's
time.
right. And, and you observe it a lot, and you attach a high probability. Now, the question about whether even there's a problem with the sort of application of probability because of the problem of induction, is something that that one might want to press. Might want to say, look, unless I can assume that the future will be like the past, unless I assume that nature is uniform, I really can't make a statistical prediction because there literally is no reason to think that the next time it's going to happen again, right? Hume argues that the belief that nature is uniform is at the heart of inductive inference, and so if you think that that's necessary, that you need to be able to demonstrate or justify the belief that nature is uniform in order to make inductive inferences, you might even be skeptical about probabilistic or statistical inferences.